Good to see everyone out this morning for us to be able to worship God. If you're visiting with us, we'd like to let you know you're an honored guest and invite you back at each and every opportunity you have to be here with us as we meet together here at Shively. It's always good to see our members out, for us to be out together to worship God. As Stuart announced, our meetings coming up Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Yep, even Sunday, so you won't have to listen to me next Sunday. Eric's going to be teaching our class Sunday morning and also preaching next Sunday morning. So hopefully you've been inviting your friends and family to that. We'll have a singing at 6 o'clock Saturday night as well. So there's a lot of time we're going to be able to spend together this upcoming weekend. So hopefully you'll make plans to be here for that. Our lesson today is a continuation of our series we started 2 weeks ago, talking about Christians and different things we may encounter in society. A lot of these things are moral issues that we are living around and amongst us each and every day as we try to live out our faith. We talked about abortion the first sermon, and we went through and discussed in, I don't want to say graphic detail, but we laid out a pretty solid case of why abortion is wrong and how we as Christians should react to that. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about racism, and I think this is a topic that we definitely need to address in the culture and climate that we live in. I think many people misunderstand racism on both sides of the argument. There are things we call racist today that aren't necessarily racist, and there are things we say that aren't racist that are racist. And the thing is when you study God's Word, racism is condemned over and over and over again by God. You know, abortion is one of those sermons I think we can kind of all get behind and say, yeah, that needs to change. That doesn't need to happen. And in the culture we live in today, these kind of lessons may make us feel very uncomfortable. Or we may be very dismissive of subjects like this and say, well, these things have no part in even being talked about in church. But lessons should be driven towards what we encounter on a daily basis. You may not be racist, but you may have family and friends that are. You may have coworkers that are. And how we respond to these things, ultimately, we are an extension of God. We are an extension of His Word. And how we respond to these things. The active definition we're going to go on with this is racism is defined as a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. It's also defined as racial prejudice or discrimination. If you've studied any amount of history, racism is seen in many different cultures. The reason that Adolf Hitler decided to attack the Jews was because he viewed himself and his people as superior to the Jews. Now, the interesting thing about that is if you dig a little bit deeper, many people believe that Hitler himself was a Jew. So he didn't like what he saw. He thought he was better. Therefore, he tried to destroy them. Notice, in fact, this is the idea that we may be superior. We are inherently superior over someone else. And that doesn't necessarily just involve race. We look at a lot of people maybe and think we are superior to them. This ultimately goes back to one specific problem, being pride. Pride is the problem here. And while we may think and may say, well, our church doesn't have a problem with that, we do know that our world that we live in and the culture we live in does have a problem with it. Racism, easily defined, is when I think that I am in one way superior and you are inferior in another. Maybe you've heard that word superiority complex. I'm better than you. That's an easy way for us to remember what this is really about. Now, we as Christians know that we are not inherently better than anyone else. In fact, that's why we became a child of God, because we realized we had sinned, we had fallen short, and we needed someone to save us. But it's interesting, many people believe that, but they view themselves better than others. See, that's how sneaky this is. It's a very sneaky thing to believe that you are better than someone else. If this is common, and I believe that it is, if this is a common thing, Why would we not want to hear lessons, receive lessons, and study on subjects that we actually encounter on our everyday walks of life? I could preach on the Sabbath this morning, but you probably don't have very many people in your life who believe that the Sabbath is a thing that we should still do. But this is something that we encounter each and every day. So how do we respond to this? Well, first off, we all would say as Christians that the Bible is our standard, so let's go there. What's the Bible say about racism? Now, one thing I've read over and over again, people that are skeptical of the Bible, they say, well, God told the children of Israel to destroy all the other nations. Is that not racism? No, it's not racism. The reason that God told them to destroy the other people was not because of their race. It was because of the gods they worshipped. They were trying to get them to fall into idolatry. Racism makes a distinction based on a person's skin color, origin, creed, race, whatever you want to say. Well, if we read the same Bible that God authored, the Bible makes no distinction because of the color of a person's skin. It makes no distinction. Now, in our culture today, there are a lot of distinctions. If you fill out paperwork for something, one of the first questions they will ask you is your race. And I think in a lot of ways people have weaponized that in a way to throw it in other people's face. Well, you have to tell me what race you are. What's that have to do with what kind of treatment or care I get? What's that have to do with anything? But we make it such a big deal in our culture when God himself does not make a big deal about it at all. He sent his son to die for all peoples, of all backgrounds, of all races. And in fact, David, when he would become king, Saul's appearance was superior to David's appearance. And Samuel goes to God and he asks God, give me a king. Give us a king. Who do you want as king? Well, he goes to Jesse. And Jesse has a number of sons. And he goes through and he's trying to figure out which son is supposed to be king. But God gives him the criteria that he's looking for in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. It says, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I've refused him, talking about Saul. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God is not going to judge us by our race. God is not going to judge us by our country. God is not going to judge us by our nationality. God does not judge by that. God looks way deeper than we do. He looks at the heart. And could you imagine if we treated every single person we come in contact with as someone who possesses a soul and possesses a heart? Because although we have a lot of cultural differences in our world today, we all have a few things in common. We all possess an eternal soul. And Samuel is told by God, I look at the heart. Now, why did they pick Saul as king? The appearance. And you've seen where that got him. God says, give me a king with a heart. And later on, David would be known as a man who follows after God's own heart. But then you do see, the scriptures do make distinctions, not based off of race. In fact, the scriptures make distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. What happened to the fact of us judging people by their character? Looking at the character of someone. Sadly, in our culture today, we don't look at the character of people, and that has nothing to do with race. That's a deeper issue in and of itself. We look at people and already make prejudices, judgments about them without ever getting to know them at all. And someone that may look unrighteous from appearance may very well be a righteous person. You know, over in James condemns them for how they were treating people that were properly dressed, as opposed to basically someone who has nothing. But Paul, in his writings, a lot of Paul's writings and a lot of the early work that the early Christians had to do was they had to unteach this complex that the Jews had, that they were superior to Gentiles. Now, when Cornelius receives the gospel, Peter receives a vision, because Peter even himself has a superiority complex of, wait a minute, you're telling me to take these unclean animals and eat them? God says to Peter, I'm paraphrasing here, what I've cleaned is clean. This separation that the Jews had made from the Gentiles, and the separations that Jews and Samaritans had with one another, they were not God-ordained separations. The Jews separated themselves from other people because they thought they were better. But over in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, I love this verse. Paul says, "For he himself, being Christ, is our peace, who made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity." Now to us, I don't know of anyone here today that is Jewish born. So when you think about it in that context, we are all on the other side of Jews, meaning we would have been looked down upon by the Jews. We're Gentiles, which just simply means non-Jewish people. But he says that Christ came to break down the middle wall of separation. Now you could view that one of two ways. You could say, well, that's our separation from God. Yes, Christ came to break down that wall. But he also came to break down the wall of saying, well, that's a Gentile. We don't associate with them. We don't have anything to do with them. And in fact, later on, Peter plays both sides. When the Gentiles come along, he's with the Jews saying, I don't eat with them. I don't hang around them at all. And what's Paul do? He calls them out on it, saying you shouldn't be making distinctions with these groups of people. It's hypocritical. But see, that's what you get to in verse 16. He says that he reconciles them both to God. And look at this. One body. One body. Not two bodies, not three bodies, not four bodies, not five bodies. One. And that enmity can easily be phrased as animosity. Jews and Gentiles did not get along. You know, the story that Jesus would tell of the Good Samaritan. That probably burned the Jews up that Jesus told that story because they hated the Samaritans. They viewed Gentiles as unclean people. That we are God's chosen people. We studied that on Wednesday night. And if we're not careful, we can come into the same complex. I'm God's chosen child. I'm one of His, and you're not. And how dangerous can that be? How many Gentiles lost their souls in that first century as Paul and Peter and other people of the first century were trying to teach them to extend a hand to the Gentiles? How many people lost their souls from that? See, the scriptures are clear. God doesn't desire one race in the sense of one ethnicity. He desires one race being all, everyone. God will make a distinction on Judgment Day between those that live righteously and those that live unrighteously, not based off of what you mark on a checklist. And that's something that we have to understand about God. And if God's that way, and the scriptures are that way, I should also be the same way. So we see what the scriptures say, but then number two, we get to this, how a Christian should view race. And this can be a very touchy subject. This can be something that maybe someone gets very upset about. And the thing is, over the history of time, many scientists have looked for scientific evidences of one's skin color. And those studies have been done under the umbrella of a theory of evolution. So you run into two problems there. See, scientists then conclude one race, with their biases being their own, was superior to everyone else's. Many of those scientists pass on information like that to people like Hitler. And Hitler goes about with an idea of racial purging of Jews, because he was told by somebody that he was superior to them. Now, we would look at that and we would say, that's terrible. I mean, even non-religious people would tell you Hitler was an awful person. But the things that Hitler believed in are still in our world today. People might not be as radical as he was, but I mean, you look and see how people treat each other. You look at the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. The Russians and Ukrainians, a lot of them look very similar, but that superiority complex is there. We're better than them. We're going to take them over. And if we're not careful, that also can seep into our culture. And we're going to talk about that as we go in more in depth, but the scriptures teach that we're all one race. People wonder about the origin of race and skin colors and different things like that, but we can all pinpoint one specific area where all of us came from. Over in Genesis chapter 3 at verse 20, Adam gives his wife Eve her name, and look at the meaning of her name. She was the mother of all living. Not some, not most, not half, all. All of us can be traced back to Adam and Eve. Meaning that when you think about it, and with our ancestors and different things like that, if we all have one common root, if we all have one common origin, there's probably not any room for me to think I'm superior over you, or for you to think you are superior over me. In Acts chapter 17 at verse 26, when we talked about the issues that the early church had with this, it says, He has made, being God, from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. All of us came from one seed. All of us came from one person or two people, Adam and Eve. And when you think of it that way, as a Christian, that kind of takes the whole race thing out of it. We all descend from the same people, meaning we are the same. Meaning if I mistreat you, I'm technically mistreating myself. And if I think you're inferior, then guess what I'm saying? I'm inferior. If you trace it back to that, it makes it very easy and simple. But Genesis chapter 9 at verse 6 really puts the nail in the coffin. It says, Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Man and woman, all have descended from God. All have been created in the image of God. And see, a lot of times our culture tries to pit us against each other. And politicians do it. And society does it. And we fall right into the trap of it. When you're treating anyone or talking to anyone or interacting with anyone, Genesis chapter 9 at the end of verse 6 should ring in our head, for the image of God he made man. All of us. All of us are made in his image. And the distinctions that we make in this life, God does not make. He does not define us by those things. He defines us as, you are created in my own image. And if we all treated each other as if we were created in God's image, which we are, how different would things be? There would be no racism. There would be no nationalism, me thinking because I'm a part of one country, I'm better than you. There would be none of that. But sometimes we put stock in those things, and we lose the true meaning of life and the true origin of life. So we were all created by God, meaning we are one race, and there is one God who died for all people. Now, the Jews had been told over and over and over again in the Old Testament that this Messiah was coming. And he comes. And what do? They reject him. They want nothing to do with their own countrymen. Like, that's how bad the Jews were. Even if you were Jewish, but you didn't look like them and you didn't relay things the way they did, they would just plain up reject you. But people like the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Throughout that study, if you want to go and study a story that breaks down the barriers of relationships with people, read that story. Because she had a lot of things working against her. Number one, she was a Samaritan. Number two, she was a woman. Number three, she obviously had baggage. But Jesus goes up and talks to her like she's just another person, which she was. And Jesus tells her, I am the Messiah. Like, I am the Son of God. And what does she do? She's amazed that he would even reveal this information to her. Now, why is that? Because she probably had encountered other Jewish people that treated her like they were basically inbreds, half-breeds. That's the way they viewed Samaritans. They despised them. They hated them. And this man sits down with her, talks to her, and then reveals he's God's son. But the thing that amplifies it to me the most is the Jews reject Jesus, but there's soldiers, centurions at the feet of his cross, that they come to the conclusion that this man truly is the Son of God. Little did they know, though, he went to the cross for them too. He went to the cross for the Jews that rejected him. He went to the cross to the Gentiles that the Jews tried to exclude. He went to the cross for all of us. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 5 through 6, it says, "For there is one God, one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all, to be testified in due time." One mediator that brings all of us to God. And notice it doesn't say he gave himself a ransom just for Jews. He gave himself a ransom just for any one particular group of people. It says he gave himself a ransom for all. He came and died for all of us. He came and shed his blood on the cross for all of us. And if any of us view ourselves worthy of that happening, if we view ourselves as, I've made it because he did that for me, why in the world would you mistreat anyone else because he did the same exact thing for them? He came and he died for all. All is an inclusive word. And it spans all the way back to Adam and Eve. And it will go forward until the end of this world. He died for everyone. Those that we see, those that have been gone long before us, those that never make it to this life, he died for all of them. Paul would talk over in Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 29. He says, "For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you were baptized into Christ and put on Christ." And look at this distinction. "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." Oftentimes when we see throughout Jesus' ministry, there is a distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles. There is a distinction throughout the Old Testament of the Jews and the Gentiles. And when you read the Old Testament, you see that God does not necessarily exclude Gentiles from his plan. Rahab was not a Jew, yet she's in the lineage of Christ. Ruth was not a Jew, yet she was in the lineage of Christ. You can't tell me that just because God's chosen people were the Jews, that God did not shine his grace on all peoples at all times and allow them opportunities to obey him and become his. But Paul puts it into plain context for us. He says no matter your race, no matter your standing, no matter your gender, no matter all the things that we categorize things in, he says no matter what those things are, the most important thing is you are all one in Christ Jesus. You are one. While the world tries to rip us apart and tear us apart on so many different things, we all have the commonality of being from God, being saved by God, and having an opportunity to become a member of his family. Now, see, that's how we should do this. This is how we should view these things. But it comes back to a phrase that we see oftentimes: love. For God so loved the world. That's inclusive of everyone. For God so loved everyone. And that type of love, that's how we should respond to all peoples. Because when we become a child of God, whether we understand this or not, or rather if we want this or not, you become a representative of God. Because that's what Christ follower means. I'm following in the footsteps of Christ. That's what Christian means. I'm a Christ follower. And you know, it's interesting. Jesus was asked a question by a lawyer over in Matthew 22. Hey, teacher, what's the most important commandment in the law? And he identifies it by saying this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. He could have stopped there. He could have said, all you got to do is love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. But the thing is, the two commandments he lists, they go together. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's pretty dumb. I would even go as far to say it's stupid to hate someone or dislike someone based off of the way they look. Why? Because although our skin tone may be different from one another, our bodies are constructed the same. They all have one specific origin. And Jesus says here to a group of Jews, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, you know, they probably thought of, well, the Jews are my neighbors. The Jews are my people. I'll love them as I love myself. But guess what? He wasn't talking about just the Jews. He would tell stories of the Good Samaritan and individuals like that. And over in Luke chapter 10 and verse 29, we see some insight to this question. He's wanting to justify himself. He said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Trying to trap him. Well, who is my neighbor then? Who is our neighbor? Is our neighbor just the people that fit into our circle of life? Is our neighbor just the people that believe the same things we believe, or practice the same things we practice, or have the same likes that we have? Who is our neighbor? Our neighbor is anybody that we come in contact with. And a lot of things, you know, we see our value in our relationship with God. I've never really met somebody that disliked themselves. Some people are hard on themselves, I understand that, but a lot of people don't call themselves racial slurs. A lot of people don't call themselves hateful terminology. A lot of people don't stereotype themselves. So if that goes to that aspect of what Jesus is saying here, if you wouldn't say it about yourself, don't say it about someone else. And that kind of hits a lot of people right between the eyes, because we want to identify who our neighbor is. But our neighbor might be that person that's the polar opposite of us, that believes nothing that we believe, that cares nothing about what we care about, who very well may hate the God whose image they were made in. But that still does not change the commandment. The same love we have for God, with the same intensity that we have for God in the way that we love. That's how we should love other people. Not giving them our whole hearts and our whole soul and our whole mind, but loving them as a creation of God. Someone created in His image. But I'll go even a step further. Racial prejudice is a violation of God's law. It's a violation. It's a sin, just like adultery, just like murder, just like fornication, just like lying, just like being lazy. We equate all these things and we say, well, you know, it's just the way I was raised. And I understand cultural norms change over time. Cultures change over time. I understand that. But God's not any different. What He said is not any different. And John confronts first century Christians about the love that they have. He says, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God, and he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Love. Now, look at the way this is phrased. For love is of God. The reason we can love is because of God. And everyone who is born, or everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. So if I hate somebody, I'm not born of God and I don't know God. Simply put. And if I don't love people, if I don't respect people, imagine being told that you don't know somebody that you claim to devote your entire life to. And see, that's the thing. That's why Jesus said there were two big commandments there. The commandment of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. They're connected to one another. Because if I love God, I'm going to have no problem loving the people that were created in his own image. Because God doesn't make mistakes. And God doesn't mess things up. So therefore, equating that back to God, we don't love people because they're easy to love. We don't respect people because they're easy to respect. Ultimately, the way we treat people is how we view God. How can you claim to love an invisible person, someone you cannot see, and hate someone that you can? It's hard to do. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27, it says, God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and every other creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created him. It's almost like racism, prejudices, things like that. If you look back to the origin of those things, it's almost like you're saying God made a mistake. Or that God shouldn't have done that. And if every person we came in contact with, if we made it our mission in life to understand that all of our origins come from God, I don't think that racism would be a thing. I don't think hatred would be a thing. I don't think superiority of one race over another would be a thing. But see, we don't see things through that lens. We're much more focused on statistics and stereotypes in our culture rather than coming back to this very simple and basic fundamental of life. All have come from God. All are created in God's image. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's all of us. Not some of us, not one race, all of us. We've all fallen short and we've all forsaken God. But I don't want to violate God's law. So that's why I need to be taking this very, very seriously. But the thing is when you come across these problems, that's what we're going to do throughout a lot of these lessons. We're going to talk about a lot of cultural problems we have and how we react as Christians. But the thing is, I think the solution is very, very, very simple. This is a very tense topic. In some ways, it very well may be controversial to some people. But the solution could not be any more simpler. And I don't mean to diminish the problem, but I think the solution is very, very simple if we are Christians, if we claim to follow God. I'll tell you what the solution is not. Political solutions do not work, and the reason why is they rely on human wisdom. I don't care what you do. I don't care how many strokes of pens are on bills. I don't care. You cannot write a law to get rid of racism, and you cannot write a law to get rid of hatred. It does not work that way. And we've seen that throughout our lifetimes. You just cannot make a law and say, well, don't hurt people because of what they look like. Because guess what? People don't care about the law. They don't care about that. They care about their own prejudices. They care about what they deem is correct or what they deem is right. You know, in fact, in many schools today, there has been an attempt to try to mend this and fix it. You may have heard of the terminology. It's called critical race theory. And the more and more that is brought into our culture, what that does is that draws lines, pits people against each other, and we're in the same exact predicament that we're in, maybe even worse. This theory comes from a European Marxist school of critical theory. It's an academic movement which seeks to link racism, race, and power to one group of people. This is very different than our civil rights movement that this country experienced back in the 60s and 70s that was structured in democracy to make it equal for everyone. These theorists, the Marxist type of people, they seek a very foundation of liberal orders such as rationalism, constitutional law, and legal reasoning. These theorists argue that American social life, political structures, economic systems are founded upon race, which in their view is a social construct. Here's the thing. What we do with that is we draw lines in the sand. You're here, I'm here. And everyone does that. Everyone in our culture does that. No one has a monopoly on racism. Not one single race has a monopoly on racism. Stereotypes exist about all types of people. People do things to mock all different types of people. And those constructs are not biblical constructs. What if we got back to where we weren't worried about social or political constructs, and instead we got back to biblical constructs? You go to Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, it says, "O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in him who walks to direct his own steps." We sometimes rely so heavily on people with biases to write laws to fix things that their bias is on their own prejudices they already have. What if we went to a God that has no prejudices? What if we made him our foundation? What if we trusted in him? What if we modeled our lives like he does? Because so often we're waiting for government, or we're waiting for schools, or we're waiting for someone to fix these problems. And I don't mean to diminish those things we have in society. They're not capable of doing it. They're just not. I have a quick solution for racism in this country. Every single person turns to God. Every single person views others like God views them. Every single person makes a God-like focus on individuals their number one priority. Because laws do not work. They don't. You can write a law and someone still is not going to follow it. It does not matter. Because laws oftentimes they rely on human wisdom. How can we fix racism? What is the solution? We need to love because God first loved us. I don't see that legislated anywhere. Treat people fairly. Love people. Look at them the way God looks at them. This country was founded on a lot of Christian beliefs, a lot of Christian thought, that all peoples were to be equal, to be respected, to be protected. But laws sometimes do not go far enough. You know, Paul would say, or Peter would say in Acts chapter 10 at verses 34 and 35, "In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him." You know, Acts 10, has a lot to do with Cornelius. And a lot of the Jews believed there were partiality, things that, they viewed the law. The law was a big thing to them. And the law that a Gentile just simply could not follow the law. They just simply could not do it. And Peter says here, God shows no partiality. God views us all the same. He views us equals. He views us as his. What if we got back to doing that? Viewing each other as an equal partner in the gospel. Acts chapter 15 verses 8 through 9. "So God, who knows the heart, acknowledged them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us, and made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith." It's interesting. The them there, I bet when that was being said, some of them were like, it's them Gentiles. It's those people. Those non-God-fearing people, those Gentiles. But Peter says here, just as he did to us, they've gotten the same thing we've gotten. They're just like us now. There's no distinction between us and them. God's purified their hearts too. And it's amazing, all throughout the New Testament, the early letters that was written to the churches, they were having to be untaught Judaism. They were having to be untaught that. This is a different way that things are going now. You need to accept these Gentiles. You need to allow those things to happen. It's interesting because a lot of the Gentiles helped out a lot of the Jews when we read in the New Testament. They weren't just background actors. They just weren't, bench players. They were actively involved. They were to love them because they were a part of something much bigger than themselves. They were a part of the church. Romans chapter 1 verses 14 through 16, he says, "I am a debtor to both Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is written of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. One of Paul's main focuses in his ministry was to take the gospel to who? The Gentiles, non-Jewish people. And guess what they did with that gospel many times? They received it. They were excited about it. And Paul didn't say, well, my Gentile brethren. No, he calls them his brethren. And he even says here, I am a debtor to both Greeks and to barbarians. I'm a preacher to them too. I'm a minister for them too. And you think of Rome, Romans were non-Jews. He writes a whole book to them. He goes and he ministers to them. And like we talked about last week, Paul's a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's about as mighty and powerful as a Jew could be in terms of the law. But he views these people, these outside people, according to a lot of the Jews, as his brethren. Romans chapter 2, verse 11, for there is no partiality with God. If you disobey God, your eternal home's the same no matter where you come from. If you obey God, your eternal home is the same no matter where you come from. And see, that's sometimes what we do. We don't view things through a Christian lens. We don't view things through a biblical lens. We view things through an American lens, or a community lens, or our own upbringing type of lens. You know, the scriptures teach us to love God. They also teach us to love one another. Now, I can say, I don't think we have a problem with this. And that's a good thing to say, because some churches are not as blessed to be able to make a statement like that. Now, we can easily fall into these traps. We can easily fall into these issues and problems. The scriptures say, take heed lest you fall. But one thing I can say with a certainty is that racism has no place here. None. Absolutely none. Because even though we may live on different parts of town or have different upbringings or maybe have different cultural backgrounds, we can all come here together and be the same. We can be one. Because there are those that do not look like me or have similar backgrounds that I have, that they need the gospel and they need a place where they can go, that these social constructs we've built up that separate us, they don't need those things to be in the way. They need those things to be ripped down. That middle wall of separation, they need that to be ripped down. You know, the scriptures, there is no one race church. There is no one background. There is no one that separates us from each other. We are to be together. The first century church, I'm sure a lot of those Jews that became Christians at first were probably a little unsettled when Gentiles started coming in. But as they began to learn, they didn't view them as Gentiles. They viewed them as their brother or sister. That's how God commands us to view one another. We are brothers and sisters. We are laboring together. We are putting our best foot forward. We're trying to encourage each other to get to heaven. We're trying to make sure that we are, in a way, building one another up so that we can make it to heaven. As society tries to rip us apart, let's come together with the one thing, the one person that brings all together, that being God. Racism has no place here. And that's a thing we need to be telling our friends and family too. You can go to a church where they'll love you. They'll pray for you. They'll check in on you. They'll be there for you. Because there's so much hatred outside these walls. It's nice to be able to go to a place where there's none. Let's continue to encourage each other. Continue to lift each other up. And let's always see people the way God intends us to see them. People created in His own image. Today's not really been a soul-stirring lesson. It's not really been about salvation a lot. But the thing is, with God, we can leave behind all the social norms and different things of this life, and propel ourselves to something much better. By becoming a child of God today, you can make the best decision you ever make. And that's an opportunity that's extended to all peoples, of all nations and all backgrounds. That by believing Jesus is the Son of God, by repenting of your sins, by confessing your faith, and by being immersed in water, you can receive the blessing of being called a child of God. It's the greatest decision you'll ever make. If you've taken those steps before and you've fallen short, or maybe you're struggling with sin, we'd love to pray for you and help you in any way that we can. If it's of a private nature, please take care of that with God. And let's remember as we go out into the world this week to conduct ourselves as God would intend for us to do. To be a good example to those around us and be a representative of what God would desire us to be. If we can pray for you, if we can help you in any way this morning, would you come forward now, together as we stand and sing.